Willow Creek was a town where time seemed to stretch like dough under a rolling pin, each day kneading into the next with comforting predictability. Situated in the heart of Ohio, it was a patchwork of clapboard houses, wide lawns sprinkled with dandelions, and a main street that boasted only one cafe, a hardware store, and a library that smelled of old paper and polished wood. The air was faintly sweet with the scent of freshly mown grass in the summer and the sharp smell of burning leaves in the gardens in the fall. It was a town where everyone knew your name, and if they didn't, they nodded anyway, as if it were only a matter of time before they became acquainted. At the edge of Willow Creek, where Maple Street dead ended, sat the modest two-story home of Jack and Sarah Thompson. Painted a soft gray with white trim, the house had a porch that creaked underfoot, testament to 30 years of enduring Midwestern storms. At one end of the porch hung a swing, its chains rusty but sturdy, swinging gently in the evening breeze. Inside, the Thompsons led a life that seemed as unremarkable from the outside as the town itself, a life of routine, small joys, and unspoken tensions that simmered beneath the surface. Jack Thompson was a man who bore his 42 years with the quiet resignation of one who had long ago accepted that dreams don't always come true. He was tall, with broad shoulders that had once carried the glory of high school football, but now bore the weight of long hours at the local sawmill. His dark hair was touched with gray at the temples, and his brown eyes, though kind, often held a distant look, as if he were searching for something just out of reach. Jack was the mill's operations manager, a job that required him to stay up late at night, sorting through schedules and inventory lists, while the rest of Willow Creek settled into the soft hum of dinner tables and bedtime stories. Sarah, his wife of 15 years, was the heart of their home. At 38, she had a quiet beauty that had not faded with age, high cheekbones, a cascade of chestnut-colored hair pulled back into a loose bun, and green eyes that sparkled when she laughed, which was not as often as it once was. Sarah worked part-time in the library, shelving books and helping the children find stories of dragons and faraway lands. The rest of her time was devoted to the house and their 11-year-old son, Ethan, whose boundless energy was both a blessing and a challenge. Sarah loved her family with all her heart, but there were times when she would stand at the kitchen sink, her hands drenched in soapy water, looking out at the backyard, and feel an empty ache she couldn't name. Ethan was the spark in their small world, a slight boy with his father's brown eyes and his mother's quick smile. He was the kind of kid who would spend hours building elaborate forts out of sofa cushions or drawing fantasy creatures in the margins of his math notebooks. School was a mixed bag. For Ethan, he excelled in art and science, but struggled with the rigid structure of multiplication tables and spelling tests. His curiosity was insatiable, and he had a habit of asking questions that left adults at a loss for answers. Asterisk, why do the stars each puntin? Why do stars appear so small when they are so big? Or what happens to rain after it falls? Jack and Sarah adored him, but their different approaches to parenting sometimes put Ethan at the center of their unspoken disagreements, like a small ship sailing through stormy waters. The Thompson household woke up to the same rhythm every morning. At 6:30, the alarm clock on Jack's nightstand would make a sharp, mechanical noise, piercing the silence. He would roll out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and shuffle to the bathroom, where he would splash cold water on his face and stare at his reflection, wondering when the lines around his eyes had become so deep. By 7, the aroma of coffee would fill the kitchen, mingling with the toast Sarah, now awake, was making. Ethan would come downstairs, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his shock of curly hair defying any comb. "Morning, champion," Jack said one such morning, ruffling Ethan's hair as he plopped down in a chair at the kitchen table. The table was solid oak, scarred with years of pencil marks and spilled juice, a silent witness to their family's history. "Morning, Dad," Ethan muttered, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Can I have cereal instead of toast?" Sarah turned from the stove, spatula in hand, her lips curling into a teasing smile. "What, you don't like my world-famous toast? I worked over a hot toaster for you." Ethan grinned, his front teeth slightly crooked, making him look younger than his 11 years. "Your toast is great, Mom, but the cereal is quicker. I want to finish my rocket drawing before school." Jack chuckled, sipping his coffee. "A rocket, huh? Planning on going to Mars or something?" "Maybe," Ethan said, his eyes lighting up. "Or maybe I'll build a ship that can fly to another galaxy, with purple stars and planets made of candy." Sarah set the cereal bowl in front of him, her smile softening. "Candy planets sound like a health hazard. Stop at Mars, kid." The morning unfolded as usual, Jack finishing his coffee, Sarah packing Ethan's lunch, a peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a slightly dented granola bar, and Ethan chatting about his latest obsession, whether it was dinosaurs, spaceships, or the strange habits of the neighbor's cat. By 7:30, Jack was out the door, his pickup humming down Maple Street toward the lumber mill. Sarah walked Ethan to the bus stop, lightly touching his shoulder, then headed to the library, where the soft rustle of pages offered a brief escape from the weight of her thoughts. But beneath the routine, there was an uneasiness in the Thompson household, a subtle tension that neither Jack nor Sarah fully acknowledged. Jack's late nights at the mill weren't just about work. The lumber industry was going through hard times, and the mill's owner, a stern man named Harold Grayson, was hinting at layoffs. Jack, who had worked his way up from floor worker to manager in 20 years, felt the pressure like a vice on his chest. He didn't talk about it to Sarah or anyone because admitting it felt like admitting defeat. Instead, he buried himself in spreadsheets and repairing equipment, coming home after Ethan was asleep, his boots full of sawdust and his mind heavy. Sarah, for her part, could feel the distance growing between them, like a slowly widening crack in a windshield. She loved Jack, she loved the life they had built, but there were days when she felt like a ghost in her own house, going through the routine of cooking and cleaning and caring for Ethan, while her own dreams of writing, of traveling, of something more died in the background. She'd always wanted to write a novel, a sweeping story about a woman who broke free from the shackles of small-town life. But the notebook she'd once used to jot down ideas now sat untouched in a drawer, piled high with bills and shopping lists. One evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky shades of peach and lavender, Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Ethan kick a soccer ball against the garage door. Rhythmic knock, knock, knock was a soothing sound, keeping her in the moment. Jack was late again, his truck still not in the driveway. She sighed, drying her hands on a dish towel, and called out, "Ethan, 5 more minutes, then it's homework time." "Well, Mom, can I have 10?" Ethan responded, his voice full of the pleading of a boy who would rather be anywhere but behind a desk. "5," Sarah said firmly, but her smile gave her away. She turned back to the sink, her thoughts drifting to the library, where she'd spent the day helping Mrs. Callahan, the head librarian, organize an exhibit of local history books. There was something soothing about the library, with its rows of shelves and the soft rustle of pages. It was a place where stories lived, where possibilities seemed within reach, if only for a moment. It was after 8 when Jack finally got home. The kitchen was dimly lit by a single light bulb over the stove. Sarah was sitting at the table, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in her hands, her eyes fixed on a book she wasn't actually reading. Ethan was upstairs, presumably doing his homework, though Sarah suspected he was drawing spaceships. "Hey," Jack said, throwing his keys down on the counter with a clank. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped, his flannel shirt wrinkled from a long day. "Hello," Sarah replied, closing her book. "Long day?" "Yeah," he opened the fridge, pulling out a beer. "Grayson's been pressing us about production numbers again. Says we're not selling enough to justify the overtime." Sarah nodded, her fingers tightening around her mug. "You've been working a lot of overtime lately." Jack took a long sip, avoiding her gaze. "Gotta keep the lights on, right?" There it was, the unspoken tension, the weight of their responsibilities pressing down like a thundercloud. Sarah wanted to say something, to ask how he was really doing, to say that she missed the days when they would talk late into the night, dreaming of the future. But the words caught in her throat, and instead she said, "Ethan has a science fair coming up. He's building a model rocket." Jack's face softened, a rare smile breaking through. That guy's going to be an astronaut someday, I swear. Maybe, Sarah said, her voice thoughtful. He has big dreams. Doesn't everyone have them? Jack said, but there was a bitterness in his tone that made Sarah's chest ache. They sat in silence, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space between them. Upstairs, Ethan's pencils scratched across the paper, a faint reminder of the life they were building, even if it seemed to be slipping through their fingers. The days in Willow Creek passed like the pages of a beloved book, each familiar but slightly frayed at the edges. Jack, Sarah, and Ethan went about their daily lives, their lives intertwined with the rhythms of their small town, the church bells on Sunday mornings, the chatter of neighbors and coffee shops, the soft glow of fireflies in the summer twilight. But beneath the surface, a story was brewing, ready to unfold, a story of dreams deferred, fears unspoken, and a family on the brink of change. As Sarah tucked Ethan into bed that night, she paused at his bedside, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "What will your spaceship look like?" she asked quietly. Ethan's eyes lit up, even in the dim light of the nightlight. "It's going to be silver, with red flames on the sides, and a window so I can see the stars. And it's going to go so fast, Mom, faster than anything in the world." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with love for this boy who dreamed of the entire universe. "This looks like a cool ship," she said. "You'll have to take me with you someday." "Deal," Ethan said, yawning. "But you have to promise to bring snacks." She laughed, kissing his forehead. "I promise." As Sarah turned off the light and closed the door, she felt a spark of hope, a reminder that even in the silence of Willow Creek, there was still room for dreams if only they had the courage to chase them. Willow Creek was walking slowly, like an old man stretching after a long sleep. The morning mist was drifting across the lawns, clinging to the branches of the maple trees, and the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the curtain of clouds, gilding the roofs of the houses. On Maple Street, life went on as usual. Bill the mailman waved to neighbors as he rode his creaking bicycle, and the school bus chugged along to collect children whose voices echoed through the quiet streets. But there was a new energy in the Thompson house that morning, subtle but insistent, like the whisper of the wind before a storm. Walter Thompson, Jack's father, had returned to Willow Creek, and his arrival promised changes that none of the family had yet foreseen. Walter was a man whose life lay in the lines of his face, like the pages of an old book, worn but full of stories. At 68, he retained a strong frame, though age and grief had hunched his shoulders slightly. His hair, once thick and dark like Jack's, was now almost completely gray, and his blue eyes, keen and watchful, held a mixture of sternness and warmth. Walter and his wife, Marge, had lived in Cincinnati for nearly 40 years, but after her death from lung cancer 3 months earlier, he had found the loneliness of their large, empty house unbearable. He sold the house and bought a small cottage 2 miles from Jack and Sarah's, on the edge of Willow Creek, where the streets were quieter and neighbors were less likely to peer over the fence. Jack learned of his father's return a week before he arrived. Walter called that evening, his voice hoarse from cigarettes and time coming through the old telephone on the kitchen table. "I'm coming back, son," he said without further ado. "I sold the house. I want to be closer to you and the boy." Jack, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee, froze, his fingers gripping the handle of the mug a little tighter than necessary. "Okay, Dad, that's great. Ethan will love this." Sarah, standing at the stove with a frying pan of scrambled eggs sizzling, glanced at her husband. She saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but she said nothing, merely nodded slightly, as if to acknowledge that she had heard the conversation. She knew that Jack's relationship with his father was complicated, not hostile, but taut, like a string that might snap if pulled too hard. Walter was an old-school man, stern and direct, and Jack, as a teenager, had often felt overwhelmed by his expectations. Now, years later, they had learned to coexist, but their conversations rarely went beyond the weather or baseball. When Walter arrived, his rust-spotted 1980s Ford pickup rumbled down Maple Street, announcing his arrival. He parked in front of the Thompson house, and Ethan, who had spotted the car from his bedroom window, ran out onto the porch, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Grandpa!" he cried, jumping off the porch and rushing toward Walter, who was slowly climbing out of the cab, leaning on the door. "Well, look at you, boy." Walter smiled broadly, his voice low and warm. He leaned down to hug Ethan, his large hands gently encircling the boy's thin shoulders. "You're already taller than you were last year. You'll catch up to your old man soon." Ethan grinned, his cheeks turning pink with joy. "I'm working out. I want to be as tall as Dad." Jack came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on his jeans. His face was friendly, but there was a wariness at the corners of his mouth. "Good to see you, Dad," he said, extending his hand. Walter shook it firmly, his palm rough as sandpaper. "And I you, son," Walter replied, looking around the house. "The place hasn't changed. Same porch, same creaks." Sarah appeared in the doorway, her hair pulled back into a loose bun and a soft smile on her lips. "Welcome, Walter," she said as she descended the steps. "How was the journey?" "Long, but manageable," he replied, his eyes lingering on her a little longer than necessary. "You look well, Sarah. How are you handling these two?" She laughed, her laughter light as a bell. "It's hard, but I'm holding on." Now it's your turn, right where you're from, and share your interesting stories in the comments. In the first days after Walter's arrival, life in the Thompson household took on a new rhythm. Walter would drop by often, bringing with him a box of donuts from the Main Street Cafe or an old photo album, which he would show to Ethan, telling stories of his childhood in Willow Creek. The boy would listen with bated breath, especially when Walter told stories of how he and his friends had fished in the local river or built shelters in the woods outside of town. "Did you really catch a fish as big as me?" Ethan asked one evening, sitting on the couch next to his grandfather, his eyes wide. Walter chuckled, his fingers running through the pages of the album. "Well, maybe not quite like you, but close. We pulled out a catfish that almost dragged me into the river. Your dad was there, about 10 years old, right, Jack?" Jack, who was sitting in a chair with a newspaper, looked up. "Yes, I remember. You were yelling at me to hold the net tighter." "And you dropped it," Walter added with a sly smile. "We almost lost the catch." Ethan chuckled, and Sarah, sitting at the table with a cup of tea, smiled at them. She loved the way Walter brought life to the house, his stories filling the rooms with a warmth she now realized she missed. She noticed how Ethan reached out to his grandfather, how his questions grew bolder, his laughter louder. But most of all, she was touched by Walter's vulnerability, which he tried to hide behind his jokes and gruff tone. Losing Marge had left him empty, and Sarah, who knew what it was like to feel lost, began looking for ways to support him. One afternoon, a week after Walter's arrival, Sarah stopped by his cottage to bring him a basket of homemade cookies. Walter's house was small but cozy, with hardwood floors and old-fashioned furniture he'd brought from Cincinnati. An old radio played soft country music in the living room, and a stack of books about World War II, Walter's favorite topic, lay on the coffee table. "Sarah, you shouldn't have," he said, opening the door and seeing the basket. His voice was grumpy, but his eyes were shining with gratitude. "It's okay," she said, setting the basket on the kitchen table. "Ethan said you liked oatmeal raisin cookies, so I thought I'd give them a try." Walter took one of the cookies, took a bite, and nodded. "Damn good. You can cook, that's for sure." She smiled, feeling warm at his praise. "Thank you. I just thought you might be lonely here. Wanted to brighten up your day a little." He looked at her, his gaze growing serious. "Lonely, yes. Without Marge. Well, let's just say the silence in the house is louder than before." Sarah nodded, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her apron. "I understand. When Jack's working late and Ethan's asleep, the house feels so empty. Sometimes I turn on the radio just to hear something other than my own thoughts." Walter chuckled, but there was no judgment in his voice. "You're a good woman, Sarah. Jack's lucky. She blushed, unsure of what to say. They stood in silence until Walter offered her a cup of coffee. They sat down at the table, and the conversation flowed easily about books, about life in Willow Creek, about how the town had changed in the last few decades. Sarah discovered that Walter was not only the stern father Jack remembered, but also a man who loved to listen, to ask questions, and to share stories that made her laugh. You know, he said, looking into his mug, Marge always said I was too serious. She used to make me dance to her favorite records, even if I grumbled. Now I wish I'd danced more often. Sarah felt a lump in her throat. She sounds like an amazing woman. She was, Walter said quietly, and she would have loved you and Ethan. Jack, meanwhile, was absorbed in his work. The mill was in crisis, and Harold Grayson, the owner, was becoming increasingly demanding. Jack spent his days juggling managing workers, checking equipment, and trying to meet shrinking budgets. He was glad his father had moved closer because it meant Walter wasn't alone, and Ethan had a grandfather who could tell him stories and teach him how to hammer nails. But Jack didn't notice how often Sarah began to drop in on Walter, how their conversations grew longer, how she came home with a wistful smile. He was too busy, too tired, to see the tenuous bond that was forming between his wife and his father. One evening, when Jack returned home later than usual, he found Sarah and Walter sitting on the porch swing. Ethan was nearby, kicking a ball around the yard, and Sarah and Walter were talking quietly, their voices blending with the evening chirp of the crickets. Jack paused at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. And then I told him that if he wanted a real fishing rod, he'd have to make it himself, Walter said, his voice full of laughter. That boy is as stubborn as Jack was at his age. Sarah laughed, her hand resting on the arm of the swing. Oh, I know. Ethan once spent 3 hours trying to build a model airplane without instructions because he said instructions are for wimps. Jack felt a pang of something not exactly jealousy, but discomfort. He cleared his throat as he opened the door, and they both turned to look at him. Hey, Dad, Sarah, he said, trying to keep his voice casual. What's the party without me? Walter grinned, rising from the swing. Just telling stories, son. Sarah told me about Ethan trying to build a spaceship out of cardboard. And he nearly glued himself to the floor, Sarah added, her eyes shining with laughter. Jack smiled, but it was a forced smile. He walked into the house, dropping his bag on the floor and heading to the fridge for a beer. Sarah followed him, her steps light, but she sensed his mood. Is everything okay? She asked, leaning against the countertop. Yeah, just tired, he replied without looking at her. It's been a long day. She was about to say something else, but Ethan ran into the kitchen, his cheeks flushed from playing. Dad, Grandpa said he's going to teach me how to make a fishing rod. Can I go see him tomorrow? Jack looked at his son, his face softening. Of course, champ. Just don't forget your homework. Ethan nodded and raced upstairs, leaving Sarah and Jack in the kitchen, their silence heavier than usual. She wanted to tell him about her conversations with Walter, how his stories made her feel less alone, but something in Jack's expression kept her silent. As the weeks went by, Walter became a more prominent part of their lives. He'd pick Ethan up from school when Sarah worked at the library, and they'd tinker in Walter's garage, hammering and laughing at old jokes. Sarah continued to visit Walter, bringing him food or just stopping by to chat. Their conversations deepened, touching on topics she rarely discussed with Jack: her dreams of writing, her fears that she was losing herself in a routine, and even her memories of childhood, when she dreamed of traveling the world. One day, sitting at Walter's kitchen table, Sarah confessed, "Sometimes I feel stuck, you know, like I should be grateful for everything I have, but I want something more." Walter nodded, his eyes full of understanding. Marge felt that way when we were younger. She wanted to go to Paris, see the Eiffel Tower. I always told her we'd do it someday. And now there's no someday. Sarah looked at him, her heart clenching. I'm sorry, Walter. He shrugged, but his smile was sad. Don't be sorry. Just, don't wait too long, Sarah. Life is shorter than it seems. The conversation stayed with her like a melody that would never be forgotten. She began writing her thoughts in an old notebook. She pulled out of a drawer not a full-length novel, but sketches, ideas, bits of stories that had been swirling around in her head. It was a small act of rebellion against her own routine, and she felt more alive than she had in years. Jack, absorbed in his work, didn't notice these changes. He was grateful for his father's presence, for Ethan's happiness, for Sarah's seeming good spirits. But he didn't see the way her eyes lit up when she talked to Walter, the way her laughter grew more frequent, the way she began to find comfort in their conversations. He didn't see them because he was too busy fighting his own demons, the fear of losing his job, the fear of not living up to expectations, the fear that he was no longer the man Sarah had married. One rainy evening, with clouds hanging like a heavy blanket over Willow Creek, Sarah and Walter were sitting in his living room, listening to Marge's old records. Ethan was visiting a friend, and Jack was working late at the sawmill. A Frank Sinatra tune was playing on the record player, and Walter, on impulse, reached out to Sarah. "Dance with me," he said, his voice half joking, but there was longing in his eyes. Sarah hesitated, but then smiled and took his hand. They swayed slowly to the music, their movements awkward but sincere. It wasn't romantic, more like a moment of connection, two people sharing the quiet pain of loss and broken dreams. When the song ended, they laughed, and Sarah felt her cheeks heat up. "You're not so bad, Walter," she said, stepping back. "You're better than I expected," he replied with a wink. When she got home, Jack was already there, sitting on the couch with a beer in his hand. He looked at her, his brows furrowing slightly. "Where have you been?" "Your father," she said, taking off her coat. "We were listening to music. He misses Marge." Jack nodded, but his gaze was distant. "It's good that you communicate with him. He needs it." Sarah wanted to tell him more, but something in his tone stopped her. She went into the kitchen to make tea, feeling the distance between them growing wider, like a river they didn't know how to cross. Willow Creek went on with its life, its rhythms unchanging, but something was changing in the Thompson household. Walter brought warmth and stories, but also new questions, new connections that no one could yet fully understand. Sarah found comfort in his company, Ethan adored his grandfather, and Jack, preoccupied with his own concerns, failed to see how the delicate threads of their family life were beginning to intertwine in new ways. Something was brewing in the quiet of their small town, and only time would tell where it would lead them. Autumn in Willow Creek smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves that crushed underfoot, reminding one of the fragility of time. On the town's main street, the cafes and shops were decorated with pumpkins and paper maple garlands, and the air had grown cooler, forcing residents to wrap themselves in scarves and pull out old flannel shirts from their closets. Inside the Thompson house, however, the chill of autumn was not only felt outside, it was beginning to creep into their family life, subtle but persistent, like the first frost on the windowsills. Jack was becoming more and more immersed in his work at the mill. His days began at dawn and ended when the stars were already dotting the sky and the house was silent. Harold Grayson, the owner of the mill, had become even more demanding, his voice, rough and harsh, sounding in Jack's office like a hammer on an anvil. "If we don't increase our shipments, Thompson, we're screwed," he would say, jabbing a finger at a pile of papers and charts. Jack would nod, clenching his jaw, and return to his spreadsheets, trying to squeeze more out of his already exhausted crew. He felt like the mill was a sinking ship, and as captain, it was his responsibility to keep it afloat, even if it meant sacrificing time with his family. Sarah, meanwhile, found solace in an unlikely place: Walter, Jack's father. His small cottage on the outskirts of Willow Creek became a refuge where she could momentarily forget about the routine, the unwashed dishes, and the way her own dreams were gathering dust in a drawer. Walter was more than just a father-in-law. He was a man who listened to her without asking for anything in return, a man whose stories about her past and easy humor made her feel like more than just a mother and wife. Their conversations, which began with innocent discussions of the weather or recipes, gradually deepened, touching on topics that Sarah rarely allowed herself to broach, even in her own thoughts. One morning, after Jack had left for the sawmill before Ethan had woken up, Sarah packed a basket of homemade apple pie and headed to Walter's. The road to his house led through a narrow path lined with old oak trees, their branches heavy with autumn leaves. She knocked on the door, and Walter opened it almost immediately, his face lit up with a warm smile. "Sarah, are you bringing treats again?" he said, stepping back to let her in. "You're spoiling me." She laughed, setting the basket down on the table. "It's just pie. Ethan helped with the dough, so there's probably too much sugar." Walter chuckled as he cut off a piece. "The boy knows what he's doing. Sit down, I'll make some coffee." They sat down at the table, and the conversation flowed as easily as a river outside the city. Sarah told them about the library, about how the children in reading classes argued about which of the book characters was cooler, the pirate or the knight. Walter, in turn, shared a story about how he worked on the railroad in his youth, and once almost got stuck in a freight car with a shipment of apples. "I smelled like apples for a week," he said, his eyes sparkling. Marge laughed until she cried, saying I looked like walking cider. Sarah smiled, but her gaze became thoughtful. "You think about her often, don't you?" Walter nodded, his fingers hovering over his mug. "Every day. Sometimes I wake up and forget she's gone. Then the silence reminds me." She reached out and lightly touched his wrist. "I'm so sorry, Walter, but you're not alone, you know. We're here. Ethan, me, even Jack, though he's not the most talkative." Walter looked at her, his eyes soft but grateful, mixed with something else Sarah couldn't quite place. "You're a kind soul, Sarah. I don't know what I'd do without your pies and chatter." She blushed, looking away. "It's just a pie." But it was more than pie. It was the hours they spent together, sharing stories, laughs, and silent moments of understanding. Sarah didn't notice how these visits became more frequent, how she began to look for excuses to visit Walter, to bring him a book from the library, to ask him for gardening advice, even though her tomato patch was overgrown with weeds. In Willow Creek, as in any small town, rumors spread faster than wildfire. It all began with an innocent observation. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly neighbor whose hobby was peeping through lace curtains, noticed Sarah walking to Walter's cottage several times a week. She mentioned it over tea at the Marge Cafe, where the local gossips congregated. By the end of the week, whispers about Sarah Thompson visiting her father-in-law too often had reached the ears of the workers at the sawmill where Jack spent his days. "Have you heard what they're saying?" Bob, one of the workers, asked during his lunch break. He was sitting across from Jack, munching on a ham sandwich. "People are saying your wife practically lives with your old man." Jack frowned, putting down his coffee. "What nonsense, Bob. Sarah's just helping him settle in. He recently lost his wife, in case you weren't aware." Bob shrugged, his expression doubtful. "I'm just repeating what I heard. People like to talk." Jack waved it off, but Bob's words stuck in his head like a splinter. He knew Willow Creek was a place where anything from a fallen tree to a new fence color was a topic of discussion. But the idea of someone talking about Sarah and his father was irritating, mixed with something else, an insecurity he didn't want to acknowledge. That night, when Jack returned home, he found Sarah washing the dishes. Ethan was already asleep, and the house was quiet, only the faucet dripping slightly, breaking the silence. Jack threw his keys on the table and opened the refrigerator, taking out a beer. "You're late again," Sarah said without turning around. Her voice was even, but there was a hint of weariness in it. "Yeah, Grayson's been pushing," Jack replied, his tone harsher than he'd intended. "Where were you today?" Sarah froze, her hands hovering in the soapy water. "At Walter's," she said, turning to him. "I took him a pie. He was telling me about his work on the railroad. I wonder, you know." Jack nodded, but his eyes narrowed. "You go there often?" She dried her hands on a towel, her eyebrows lifting. "He's lonely, Jack. I'm just trying to be a good daughter-in-law. You're glad he moved here, aren't you?" Of course I'm glad, he said, but his voice was strained. It's just. People are starting to talk. Sarah frowned, her hands on her hips. What people? What are they saying? Nothing serious, Jack raised his hands in surrender. Just gossip. You know how it is in this town. She looked at him, her green eyes searching his face for something he couldn't give her. If there's something you want to say, Jack, just say it. I don't want to say anything, he snapped, turning away. Forget it. I'm tired. Sarah opened her mouth to reply, but thought better of it. She turned back to the dishes, her movements jerky, and the silence between them heavier than usual. The next day, Jack couldn't shake Bob's words. He watched Sarah at breakfast, slicing an apple for Ethan, her smile a little brighter than before. He remembered her laughing on the porch with Walter, her hand on his shoulder as they talked about Ethan. They were small things, but they fit together in his mind like a puzzle he didn't want to finish. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her visits to Walter. She liked the way he listened to her, the way he didn't judge her for her doubts or fears. One day, sitting in his living room, she pulled out her old notebook of sketches and showed him a few pages. They're just ideas, she said, her voice unsure. I haven't written anything serious in years. Walter flipped through the notebook, his fingers treading the pages carefully. These are more than just ideas, Sarah. You have a voice. You must continue. She smiled, her heart beating faster. Do you really think so? I'm not one to throw around empty words, he said, his gaze warm but serious. Marge always said to do what makes you feel alive. Do you feel alive when you write? Sarah nodded, her eyes shining. Yes, but I don't know where to start. And Jack, he doesn't understand. Walter leaned closer, his voice quieter. Jack's a good boy, but he's stubborn, like I was at his age. Give him time. In the meantime, write. For yourself. The conversation stayed with her, like a warm coal, heating her from the inside. She began writing more often in secret when Ethan was at school and Jack was at work. They were short stories, sketches about a woman searching for herself in a small town, about dreams she was afraid to let go of. Each time she shared them with Walter, he read them carefully, asked questions, and offered ideas. Their connection deepened, but Sarah saw it as nothing more than friendship, the support she had been missing. The rumors in Willow Creek were growing. At Marge's, Mrs. Henderson was whispering to the other women, her voice full of suggestiveness. I saw Sarah at Walter's again. She spends hours there. It's not good. Maybe she's just helping an old man. Linda, the waitress, countered, but her tone was uncertain. It helps, of course, Mrs. Henderson snorted. Walter's a widower, and Sarah. Well, you know how it is. By the end of the week, word had reached the library where Sarah worked. Mrs. Callahan, her boss, mentioned it in passing, her voice soft but with a note of warning. Sarah, you know how people like to talk. Maybe you should be careful about visiting Walter. Sarah flushed, her fingers tightening around the book she was holding. It's just friendship, Mrs. Callahan. He's lonely, and I'm just trying to help. I know, dear, Mrs. Callahan said, patting her hand. But in this town, people see what they want to see. Sarah left the library with a heavy heart. She didn't want her kindness to Walter to become fodder for gossip, but the thought of stopping her visits was unbearable. He was more than just a father-in-law. He had become her friend, a man who saw her as more than just a wife and mother. Jack, meanwhile, began to notice little things that had previously escaped his notice. Sarah often mentioned Walter in conversation, her eyes lighting up when she told him stories or jokes. She smiled more often, but her smiles were rarely directed at Jack. He tried to brush these thoughts aside, telling himself that it was just him being tired, that the rumors were just idle chatter. But one night, when he came home and couldn't find Sarah, and Ethan told him she was at her grandfather's, something inside him snapped. He sat down on the couch, his hands gripping the bottle of beer so tightly that his knuckles were white. When Sarah returned, her hair was slightly tousled by the wind, and she had a wistful smile on her face. "Where have you been?" Jack asked, his voice quieter than usual, but there was tension in it. "Walter," she said, taking off her coat. "We were talking about my writing. He thinks I have potential." Jack looked at her, his gaze heavy. "You spend more time with him than with me." Sarah froze, her eyes widening. "Jack, it's not like that. He understands me. You're so busy, I can barely see you." "Do you think I like this?" he snapped, standing up. "I work so we can live, Sarah. And you run to my father while I toil." Her face paled, but she sat up straighter, her voice firmer. "It's not fair, Jack. I'm not running. I'm trying to be there for a man who lost his wife. And maybe if you were home more often, I wouldn't feel so alone." The words hung in the air like smoke. Jack opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. He turned and walked out onto the porch, leaving Sarah standing in the kitchen, her hands shaking, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The next morning, Jack left for work without a word. Sarah watched his truck disappear around the corner, her heart aching. She didn't want to fight, didn't want her concern for Walter to cause discord. But she couldn't deny that her connection with Walter gave her something she couldn't find at home, a sense of being seen, of being heard. Ethan, oblivious, continued to enjoy his grandfather's presence. He spent more and more time with Walter, learning to make fishing rods or listening to stories of the good old days. But even he began to sense the tension between his parents, his questions growing quieter, his smiles less frequent. Willow Creek, with its pumpkins and autumn leaves, went on with its life. But in the Thompson house, the first alarm bell rang like a bell in the fog. Jack, Sarah, and Walter were bound together by the bonds of family, but those bonds were beginning to stretch, threatening to snap. Something had to change, and soon, but none of them knew how to find their way forward in this maze of unspoken words and hidden fears. The evening light in Willow Creek poured into the streets like warm honey, gilding the treetops and casting long shadows across the sidewalks. October had come into its own, and the town was wrapped in the soft warmth of an Indian summer, when a light jacket was still acceptable during the day and the air at night was sharp, a reminder of winter's approach. On Maple Street, children rode their bikes, their laughter ringing in the silence, and the smell of pumpkin soup and freshly baked bread wafted through the open windows of the houses. But in the Thompson house, the idol seemed fragile, like a glass figurine ready to shatter at the slightest push. Sarah, standing at the kitchen window, looked out into the backyard where Ethan was building a tower out of old boxes, and felt her heart torn between duty and something new and frightening that she could neither name nor deny. Sarah and Walter, Jack's father, spent more and more time together. What had begun as innocent visits with pie and conversations about the past became a ritual that Sarah looked forward to with anxious anticipation. Walter had become more than just a father-in-law. He was a man who saw her not just as Jack's wife or Ethan's mother, but as a woman with dreams, fears, and desires she had spent years suppressing. His cottage on the edge of Willow Creek became her refuge, a place where she could be herself, if only for a few hours. One afternoon, when Ethan was staying overnight at a friend's house and Jack was working late at the sawmill as usual, Sarah knocked on Walter's door, holding an old book from the library, a collection of Hemingway stories she had borrowed for him. The door opened, and Walter, dressed in a faded flannel shirt, smiled, his blue eyes sparkling in the soft lamplight. "You're bringing presents again," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. "What is it this time?" "Hemingway," Sarah said, holding out the book. "You said you loved him. It's The Old Man and the Sea. I thought you'd enjoy rereading it." He picked up the book, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm, and the brief contact made Sarah freeze. She quickly looked away, feeling her cheeks warm. "I'll make some tea," she muttered, heading toward the kitchen to hide her embarrassment. They sat down at the table, and the conversation flowed, as always. Walter told of his father, who was a fisherman and taught him how to tie knots, and Sarah shared a story about how, as a child, she dreamed of becoming a writer and once sent a story to a magazine, but it was rejected. They said I had promising writing, but the story didn't quite fit, she said, her voice full of irony. I was so angry I didn't write for months. Walter leaned closer, his gaze warm and attentive. They were wrong, Sarah. You have a gift. I've read your sketches, and they have soul. She smiled, her heart beating faster at his words. You are too kind to me, Walter. Not kind, he countered, his voice growing quieter, just honest. The silence hung between them, filled with something new, something unknown. Sarah felt her breathing quicken and quickly stood up to pour more tea, even though her mug was almost full. She didn't want to admit that this feeling wasn't just gratitude, it wasn't just friendship. It was something dangerous, something that made her heart beat faster, but also squeezed her in a vice of guilt. Meanwhile, Jack was drowning in his own worries. The mill was on the verge of closing, and each day brought new problems, broken equipment, disgruntled workers, pressure from Grayson. Jack returned home exhausted, his mind on numbers and charts, not his wife or his father. But the rumors that had begun to swirl around Willow Creek were growing louder, and he couldn't ignore them. Last week, Bob, his co-worker, brought it up again, his voice full of innuendo. People say Sarah and your old man are too close, he said, chewing gum. I don't want to pry, Jack, but you should know what's going on. Jack gritted his teeth, his fists clenched. It's just gossip, Bob. Sarah's helping her father, that's all. Whatever you say, Bob replied, but his look said he didn't believe it. Jack tried to brush the words aside, but they clung to him like burrs. He began to notice how often Sarah mentioned Walter, how her eyes lit up when she told him stories or jokes. He saw her coming home with a wistful smile, her steps lighter, as if she were carrying a secret. Jack told himself it was nonsense, that his father was a widower and Sarah his wife, the mother of his son. But doubts, like shadows, began to grow in his heart. One evening, returning home earlier than usual, Jack found Sarah at her desk, her notebook open, her pen moving quickly across the paper. She looked up, and a smile lit up her face, but there was something nervous about it. You're early, she said, closing the notebook. Is it a nice day? Not exactly, he replied, throwing his keys on the table. Grayson's threatening layoffs again. What are you doing? Just writing, she said, her voice light but her eyes avoiding him. Walter asked me to keep going. He says I'm getting the hang of it. Jack nodded, but his jaw was tense. Walter, huh? You spend a lot of time with him. Sarah looked at him, her brows furrowing. Jack, we've talked about this before. He's lonely. I'm just trying to be there for him. Close, he repeated, his voice colder than he intended. People are starting to talk, Sarah. It doesn't look good. Her face went pale, but she straightened up, her eyes flashing. Do you really believe this gossip? I thought you knew me better. I know you, he said, but his voice shook. But I don't know what happens when you're there with him. Sarah shook her head, her hands shaking. You can't be serious. This is your father, Jack. He opened his mouth to reply, but decided against it. Instead, he grabbed a beer from the fridge and walked out onto the porch, leaving Sarah standing in the kitchen, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and guilt. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay next to Jack, listening to his breathing, but her mind was elsewhere. She remembered the moment at Walter's when their hands had touched, how her heart had stopped, how his gaze had lingered on her just a little too long. It had been a fleeting moment, but it had left a mark on her, like a footprint in the sand. She hated herself for thinking these thoughts, for allowing them to grow, but she couldn't deny that she felt alive with Walter alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. The next day, while Ethan was at school and Jack was at work, Sarah went to see Walter again. She told herself it was just a visit, that she just wanted to share a new story, but her heart was beating faster than usual as she knocked on his door. Walter opened the door, his face lit up as always. Sarah, you're like a ray of sunshine on this gray day, he said, his voice warm but with something new in it, something that made her freeze. They sat down in the living room and Sarah took out her notebook, but instead of reading, she suddenly fell silent, her fingers fiddling nervously with the corner of the page. Walter noticed her tension and leaned closer. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. She shook her head, but her eyes gave her away. I... I don't know, Walter. It's all so confusing." He looked at her, his gaze deep as a lake in the forest. "Tell me." And then, without knowing why, Sarah began to talk. She talked about Jack, about how he was withdrawing, about how she felt invisible at home, about how her dreams of writing seemed like the only way to keep herself from being lost. And then, almost in a whisper, she confessed, "And you make me feel like I'm more than just a wife and a mother, and I don't know what to do with it." Walter was silent, his face serious, but there was something in his eyes she couldn't read. He reached out slowly and covered her hand with his. "Sarah," he said quietly, "you are special. You always have been special. But this is a dangerous path." She nodded, her throat tightening. "I know. I don't want this, but I can't stop coming here." And then, in the quiet of his living room, with the soft crackle of an old radio playing, something Sarah had both feared and desired happened. Walter leaned closer, his hand still on hers, and their faces were so close she could feel the warmth of his breath. It wasn't a kiss, not exactly, but their foreheads touched, and for a moment the world disappeared. It was a moment of vulnerability, a closeness that was both wrong and unbearably right. Sarah closed her eyes, her heart pounding, a voice in her head screaming at her to stop. She pulled away first, her breathing ragged. "We can't," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's wrong." Walter nodded, his hand slowly releasing hers. "I know," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I didn't mean to. I shouldn't have." She stood up, her hands shaking as she gathered her things. "I have to go," she said, not looking at him. "Ethan will be back soon." Walter made no move to stop her, but his eyes followed her until she was out the door. As she walked down the path back to her home, the autumn wind whipped her cheeks, as if trying to bring her to her senses. Guilt washed over her in waves, but there was another feeling with it, a longing she couldn't shake. At home, Sarah tried to get back into her routine, but nothing felt right. She cooked dinner, helped Ethan with his homework, but her mind was elsewhere. She saw Walter's face in front of her, his eyes, his hand in hers. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't stop thinking about how he made her feel alive, needed, wanted. Jack, returning home, noticed her detachment. He sat at the table, watching her chop vegetables for a salad, her movements mechanical. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "Yes," she lied, not looking up. "I'm just tired." He nodded, but his gaze lingered on her. "Were you with your father today?" Sarah froze, her knife resting on the carrot. "Yes, for a while," she said, her voice too high. "I took him a book." Jack looked at her, his jaw tense. "You spend a lot of time with him, Sarah. People say things, and I'm beginning to think they're not entirely wrong." Her heart sank. "Jack, this is ridiculous. He's your father. I'm just trying to be kind." "Good," he repeated, his voice full of sarcasm. "Are you sure that's all?" Sarah turned to him, her eyes flashing. "You really think I'm capable of something like that, after everything we've been through?" He looked at her, his face a mixture of anger and pain. "I don't know what to think, Sarah. You've changed, and I don't know what's going on." She wanted to scream, wanted to tell him everything, her pain, her longing, how Walter had given her what she couldn't find at home. But instead, she turned back to the sink, her hands shaking. "I'm tired, Jack. Let's not." He stood up and walked out of the kitchen, his steps heavy. Sarah was left alone, her heart torn between the guilt of how she felt and the pain of losing her connection with her husband. Ethan, unsuspecting, continued to enjoy his grandfather's presence. He spent weekends with Walter, making fishing rods and listening to stories of old adventures. But even he began to notice that his parents were quieter, their conversations shorter, their smiles less frequent. One night, as Sarah was tucking him into bed, he looked up at her with his big brown eyes. "Mom, did you and Dad have a fight?" he asked, his voice quiet. Sarah forced a smile, even as her heart sank. "No, honey. We're both just busy. Everything will be fine." He nodded, but his eyes were full of doubt. As she turned off the light and closed his door, she underscore void. She felt her eyes fill with tears. She knew she couldn't go on like this, but stopping her feelings was as impossible as stopping time. Winter crept up on Willow Creek like a cat stalking a snowy yard. By November, the streets of the town were covered in a thin layer of frost, and the breath of passers-by turned into white clouds that dissolved into the cold air. On Maple Street, the streetlights cast a soft glow on the frozen sidewalks, and each evening, as dusk settled over the houses, the Thompsons' windows glowed a warm yellow, creating the illusion of comfort. But inside their home, the warmth was deceptive, like a mirage in the desert, hiding cracks that grew wider with each passing day. Jack, whose heart now beat to the rhythm of doubt, began to notice little things that, like tiny shards of glass, cut him from the inside, forcing him to ask questions he was afraid to answer. Jack had always been a man of facts. As a manager at a sawmill, he was used to understanding numbers, charts, and specific problems: broken equipment, late deliveries, disgruntled workers. But now his analytical mind had turned against him, picking up on details in Sarah's behavior that he had previously ignored. Her frequent absences to see Walter, her wistful smiles, her unexpected energy, they all fit together into a puzzle he didn't want to see in its entirety. But the last few days had brought new clues, small but sharp as needles, and they were nagging at him. It all started with a smell. On a Friday night, returning home from another long day at the sawmill, Jack hugged Sarah as he always did, but his nose caught an unfamiliar scent light, spicy, with notes of sandalwood and citrus. It was a man's cologne, not his own, smelling like cheap aftershave from the local supermarket. He paused, his hands still on her waist, and looked into her eyes. "New perfume?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Sarah blinked, her green eyes widening for a moment before she smiled. "Oh, it must have been the library books. Someone spilled something scented there. Mrs. Callahan has been complaining all day." Jack nodded, but his stomach clenched. He knew Sarah had spent the morning at Walter's. She'd mentioned it at breakfast, saying she'd brought him some soup because he had a cold. The library, maybe, but the smell was too strong, too fresh to be a fluke. He let go of her and headed for the refrigerator, getting a beer to hide his unease. But the smell lingered in his mind like a splinter. The next day, he noticed something else. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, her phone lying next to her, the screen lit up with an incoming message. Jack, standing at the stove where he was heating up leftover pizza for Ethan, glanced at the screen. It was from Walter. "Thanks for today. You sure know how to cheer me up." Jack felt his jaw tense, but he said nothing. Sarah grabbed the phone, her fingers quickly running across the screen, and she put it in her pocket without saying a word. Jack was about to ask what it was, but Ethan ran into the kitchen demanding pizza, and the moment was gone. "Dad, can I have 2 pieces?" Ethan asked, his curls bouncing as he reached for the plate. "Take it, champ," Jack said, forcing a smile. But his eyes were on Sarah, who was now washing the dishes, her movements a little faster than usual, as if she were trying to distract herself. That night, lying in bed, Jack couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, where the shadows from the street lamp made patterns, and his thoughts swirled around Sarah and Walter. He remembered their conversations on the porch, her laughter, her light touch on his arm. He remembered the rumors he'd heard at the mill Bob's words, the mocking looks of the other workers. He told himself it couldn't be possible that his father, a widower who'd lost his wife only a few months before, couldn't. But the thought, once it was there, wouldn't go away. It grew like a weed, taking root in his mind. The next morning, Jack decided to take action. They had a simple security system at home, a pair of cameras mounted on the porch and back door that he'd installed a couple of years ago after a bike was stolen in a nearby town. The cameras were cheap, but they recorded everything that happened around the house and stored the footage on an old laptop in the basement. Jack had never checked them, there was no need, but now he felt he should. After Sarah left for the library and Ethan went to school, Jack went down to the basement. It was cramped, smelled of damp and old wood, and was filled with boxes full of Christmas decorations and Ethan's old toys. He turned on his laptop, which creaked and hummed like an old man annoyed at being woken up. Opening up the video viewer, he began scrolling through the last few days of video, his heart beating faster than he'd like to admit. Familiar scenes flashed across the screen. Bill the mailman throwing a newspaper on the porch, the neighbor's dog running around the yard, Ethan kicking a ball. But then Jack noticed something odd. Yesterday afternoon, around 2 o'clock, Sarah had left the house carrying a bag and was heading down Maple Street toward Walter's cottage. Nothing out of the ordinary, she went there often. But 3 hours later, she returned, and the rearview camera had captured her entering the house, her hair slightly disheveled, her cheeks flushed as if she'd been running. Jack rewound the footage and watched again. Nothing obvious, but something about the way she walked, the quick movements, made his stomach clench. He looked for a few more days, but found nothing more. Sarah would go out and come back, sometimes with a basket, sometimes with a book, but nothing that could be considered evidence. Yet the lack of evidence did not reassure him. In fact, it fueled his suspicions. He closed the laptop, his fingers shaking, and went upstairs, feeling his world begin to crumble. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her visits to Walter, though after their last moment of intimacy, she kept her distance. She promised herself that she would no longer let her emotions get the better of her, that she would keep their meetings within the bounds of friendship. But every time she saw him, her resolve weakened. Walter was attentive, his words were warm, and his presence filled the emptiness she felt at home. She hated herself for it, but she couldn't stop. One day, sitting in his living room, she leafed through her notebook, reading him a new story, a story about a woman who left a small town to find herself. Walter listened, his eyes glued to hers, and when she finished, he smiled. "That's powerful, Sarah," he said, his voice low and sincere. "You write as if you've lived 10 lifetimes already." She blushed, her fingers tightening on the notebook. "Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without your support." He looked at her, his gaze warm but wary. "You deserve better than this town, Sarah. Don't let it suffocate you." She nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to say more, but the memory of the moment their foreheads touched flashed through her mind, and she stood quickly. "I have to go," she said, her voice hoarse. "Ethan will be back soon." Walter didn't try to stop her, but his eyes followed her until she was out the door. As she walked home, her thoughts were chaotic. She knew she had gone too far, that her feelings for Walter were wrong, but she couldn't deny that he gave her something she couldn't find at home, a sense of being alive. That evening, Jack sat on the porch, his beer untouched on the railing. He looked out onto the street, where the neighbors' children were playing tag, their laughter an echo from another life. Sarah was in the kitchen, making dinner, her voice coming through the open window as she talked to Ethan about his school project. Jack tried to focus on the sound, on the normalcy of their lives, but his mind kept wandering to the smell of cologne, to the text on her phone, to her wild hair on the camera. As Sarah stepped out onto the porch, carrying a plate of sandwiches, she paused, noticing his gaze. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Yeah," he lied, his fingers tightening on the railing. "Just thinking." "About what?" She sat down next to him, her knee slightly touching his, but he moved away. "About work," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Grayson is pressuring me again." She nodded, but her gaze was full of doubt. "Are you sure that's all?" He looked at her, his eyes dark as storm clouds. "What else? Is there something you want to tell me, Sarah?" Her face went pale, but she shook her head. "No, Jack, nothing." He nodded, but his heart was pounding. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that his suspicions were just the product of fatigue and gossip. But the scent of cologne, the message, her detachment, it was all real, and he couldn't pretend any longer that it wasn't happening. The next day, Jack decided to check the cameras again. He waited until Sarah had gone to the library and Ethan had gone to school, and then went down to the basement again. This time, he reviewed the footage for the past week, his eyes watching each frame carefully. He saw Sarah leaving the house, coming back, her steps quickening, her face sometimes too thoughtful. But nothing obvious, no hugs, no strange visitors, no Walter outside their house. Still, the lack of evidence didn't calm him. It only increased his paranoia, making him wonder, what if she was meeting Walter somewhere else? What if they were more careful than he thought? That evening, when Sarah returned home, Jack noticed something else. She had taken off her coat, and he caught the same scent of cologne on her sweater, faint but distinct. He froze, his hands clenched into fists, but said nothing. Sarah, oblivious to his tension, began to tell him about how Ethan had gotten on his science project, but her voice sounded like background noise to Jack. "Have you been to see your father again?" he asked suddenly, interrupting her. Sarah paused, her eyes widening. "Yeah, I just stopped by. He asked me to help him with a shelf in the garage." "A shelf," Jack repeated, his voice even but menacing. "How long did it take?" "Jack, what are you trying to say?" Her voice grew sharper, her hands on her hips. "Are you listening to gossip again?" "I don't listen to gossip," he said, his eyes flashing. "I see what's going on. You've changed, Sarah, and I'm not a fool." She opened her mouth to answer, but Ethan ran into the kitchen holding a drawing of a rocket. "Dad, look what I made. Grandpa said it looks like a real one." Jack forced a smile, but his gaze remained cold. "Cool, champ. Go put this in your room." Ethan ran away, and Sarah looked at Jack, her eyes full of pain. "You're wrong, Jack," she said quietly. "But if you don't believe me, I don't know how to fix it." She turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving him standing there alone, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and fear. He knew he had to find evidence to either confirm his suspicions or disprove them. But with each passing day, the truth seems further away and his world closer to the edge. Willow Creek went on with its life, its streets sparkling with frost as its residents prepared for the winter holidays. But in the Thompson house, winter had already arrived, cold, unforgiving, full of unspoken words and hidden fears. Jack, consumed by his suspicions, stood on the threshold of a decision that could either save his family or destroy it forever. And Sarah, torn by guilt and longing, tried to find her way back to herself, not knowing how far she had already gone. Snow fell in soft flakes on Willow Creek, blanketing the town in a white blanket that muffled sounds and softened edges. By early December, the streets were like a Christmas card. Lanterns strung with strings of lights, shop windows twinkling with colorful lights, and the scent of gingerbread and pine wafted from the houses. On Maple Street, children were building snowmen, their laughter ringing in the frosty air, but inside the Thompson house, this winter wonderland seemed far away. Within their walls, there was a silence as heavy and cold as the ice on the river outside town. Jack, whose suspicions about Sarah and his father, Walter, had become obsessive, decided it was time to act. He could no longer live in this fog of doubt. He needed answers, even if they destroyed everything he knew. Jack had always been a man who preferred to confront problems head-on. At the sawmill where he spent his days, he fixed broken machines, resolved worker disputes, and found ways to meet tight deadlines. But this problem, his marriage, his family, his father, was not the kind that could be solved with a wrench or a stern talking to. The smell of cologne on Sarah's sweater, her evasive answers, the texts from Walter on her phone, they all swirled around his head like snowflakes in a blizzard, tugging at his nerves. He checked the security footage from the house, but it yielded nothing but more questions. Now he felt he had to move on, even if it meant crossing a line he'd never crossed before. The idea came about on a Monday morning, as Jack sat in his office at the sawmill, looking out at the snow-covered yard through a murky window. Harold Grayson, the owner, mentioned a meeting with suppliers in Columbus the following week. Jack, who usually avoided traveling for fear of leaving Sarah and Ethan alone, suddenly saw an opportunity. What if he pretended to be leaving on a business trip? If he disappeared for a few days, Sarah and Walter might relax, thinking no one was watching. It was a trap risky, almost mean-spirited, but Jack felt he had no choice. He had to know the truth. That night, back at home, Jack sat at the kitchen table while Sarah cooked dinner, fried chicken and mashed potatoes, the warm aroma of which filled the house. Ethan was upstairs, building a model airplane, his voice coming through the open door as he hummed the theme song to a cartoon. Jack watched Sarah, her movements familiar but distant, as if she were somewhere else. He cleared his throat, clutching his mug of coffee. "Sarah, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice even but tense. She turned around, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyebrows raised slightly. "What happened?" "Grayson's sending me to Columbus for a couple of days," he said, looking into her eyes. "Meeting with suppliers. I'll leave Wednesday morning and be back Friday night." Sarah blinked, her face neutral, but Jack noticed her fingers tightening slightly on the edge of her apron. "Oh," she said, "that's unexpected. Are you sure you can't send someone else?" "Grayson insists," Jack lied, trying to sound convincing. "It's important to the sawmill. I can't refuse." She nodded, her lips forming a small smile. "Okay, Ethan and I can handle it. Maybe I'll ask Walter to help him if I'm delayed in the library." Walter's name, spoken so casually, cut Jack like a knife. He forced a smile, though his jaw was tense. Of course, Dad's always happy to spend time with Ethan. Sarah turned back to the stove, and Jack watched her back, trying to catch even the slightest hint of her thoughts. Was she glad he was leaving? Had she planned to spend these days with Walter? He hated himself for thinking these thoughts, but they were stronger than he was. The trap was set, and now all he could do was wait. The next day, Jack began preparing. He had no intention of moving to Columbus instead. He found a small Airbnb in a nearby town, Riverview, just 20 minutes from Willow Creek. The place was cheap, on the second floor of an old house, with a view of the river and creaky wood floors. Jack booked it for 3 nights, using an old credit card so Sarah wouldn't notice the transaction. He told himself it wasn't a betrayal. It was a way to protect his family, his marriage, his sanity. But deep down, he knew it was a step into an abyss from which there might be no return. On Tuesday evening, Jack packed a small bag, throwing in a couple of shirts, jeans, and a toothbrush to give the appearance of leaving. He deliberately left the bag in plain sight in the bedroom, where Sarah would see it. When she returned from the library, her hair was dusted with snow, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She looked at the bag, her eyes lingering on it for a moment. "Already packed?" she asked, taking off her coat. Her voice was light, but there was something in it that Jack couldn't decipher. "Yes," he replied, standing at the bedroom door. "I want to leave early to avoid traffic." She nodded, her gaze sliding over his face. "Be careful, okay, and call me when you get there." "Of course," he said, his throat tight. He wanted to hug her, to tell her everything would be okay, but instead he just nodded and walked out into the living room, where Ethan was watching TV. "Hey, champ," Jack said, sitting down next to his son. "I'm going away for a couple of days. You'll listen to your mom, okay?" Ethan turned, his brown eyes full of curiosity. "You're going to the big city, Dad? Bring me something cool, like a robot." Jack laughed, though it was strained. "Let's see what I can find. Be good, okay?" Ethan nodded, and Jack ruffled his hair, feeling his heart clench. He hated himself for what he had done, for suspecting Sarah, for endangering their family. But he couldn't stop, not now that doubt was part of his breath. On Wednesday morning, Jack pretended to leave. He loaded the bag into his truck, slammed the door loud enough for Sarah to hear, and started the engine. She stood on the porch, her arms crossed over her chest, a weak smile on her face. "Good luck, Jack," she said, her voice soft. "Call me tonight." "Sure," he said, waving at her. He pulled out of the driveway, feeling her eyes on his back, and headed toward Riverview. But instead of Columbus, he parked at an old house on the outskirts of a neighboring town, where a rented apartment awaited him. The apartment was cramped, with a threadbare couch, a small television, and a kitchen that smelled of old coffee. The windows looked out onto a river, its waters glistening in the morning sun, but Jack barely noticed the view. He dropped his bag on the floor and sat down on the couch, his hands shaking. He pulled out his phone and opened the app for the security cameras he'd set up on the house. The cameras were his eyes, his way of keeping an eye on Sarah and Walter while he was away. He told himself it was temporary, that he just wanted to make sure his suspicions were unfounded. But deep down, he was afraid of what he might see. Meanwhile, Sarah, alone with Ethan, felt a strange relief. Jack was home so rarely that his absence didn't seem like a novelty, but the thought of him being away on business gave her room to breathe. She tried to focus on her routine, the library, cleaning, helping Ethan with his homework, but her thoughts inevitably wandered to Walter. She tried to keep her distance since their last moment of intimacy, their foreheads touching, but it was like trying to stem the tide. She missed his voice, his stories, the way he made her feel seen. That same day, after dropping Ethan off at school, Sarah decided to stop by Walter's. She told herself it was just a friendly visit, that she just wanted to check on him and see how he was coping with his cold. But when she knocked on his door, her heart was beating faster than she'd like to admit. Walter opened the door, a warm smile lighting his face. "Sarah, you're on time as always," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "I just made some coffee." She walked in, her hands clutching the book she'd brought as an excuse. "I thought you might like this," she said, handing him a collection of O'Connor's stories. The library said it was a classic. He picked up the book, his fingers brushing lightly over it, and Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "You know how to surprise me," he said, his voice low and warm. "Sit down and tell me how things are." They sat down at the table, and the conversation flowed as easily and naturally as it always did. Sarah told them about Ethan's new project, a model solar system for school, and Walter shared a story about how, as a child, he tried to build a telescope out of old glasses and a cardboard tube. But beneath the surface of their words, there was a tension that they both felt but didn't acknowledge. Sarah avoided looking him in the eye for too long, afraid that her feelings would spill out again. "Jack's gone on a business trip," she said suddenly, her voice quieter than she intended. "For a couple of days." Walter nodded, his gaze wary. "Yeah, he mentioned it. Said he was going to Columbus." "Yeah," she confirmed, her fingers fiddling with the rim of her mug. "So I'm alone with Ethan." The silence hung between them, heavy and full of unspoken words. Walter looked at her, his eyes deep as the winter sky. "Sarah," he said quietly, "we have to be careful, after that day." She nodded, her throat tightening. "I know, I don't want it to happen again, but I can't stop coming here." He reached out his hand, but stopped short of touching it. "Me too," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "But it's wrong. For Jack, for Ethan, for all of us." Sarah closed her eyes, her heart breaking. She knew he was right, but her feelings were stronger than her will. She stood up, her movements jerky. "I have to go," she said, grabbing her bag. "See you later, Walter." He didn't try to stop her, but his eyes followed her until she was out the door. As Sarah walked home, the snow crunched under her boots and her thoughts were chaotic. She hated herself for her weakness, but she couldn't deny that Walter was her salvation from the loneliness she felt at home. In Riverview, Jack sat in his rented apartment, his eyes glued to his phone. The cameras showed the usual scenes: Sarah leaving the house in the morning, Ethan running to the school bus, Bill the mailman throwing down the newspaper. But that afternoon, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Sarah walked out of the house, book in hand, and headed toward Walter's cottage. She returned 2 hours later, her hair slightly disheveled, and that wistful smile on her face that he had been seeing more and more often. Jack clutched the phone, his fingers white. He wanted to storm the house, demand answers, but he knew it would be no use. He had to be patient and had to wait for something more obvious. He opened his laptop and connected to the live cameras, his eyes watching every move. He hated himself for spying on his wife, for suspecting his father, but he couldn't stop. That night he called Sarah as he had promised, his voice strained but trying to sound normal. "Hey, I'm in Columbus," he lied, sitting on the creaky couch in Riverview. "How are things at home?" "It's okay," Sarah said, her voice soft but tired. "Ethan made a model of Jupiter for school. He's so proud." "That's great," Jack said, his throat tightening. "What about you?" "Fine," she said, but her pause was too long. "Just busy. I saw Walter today. He's still coughing." Walter's name hit him like a hammer. "Yes," he said, trying not to let his voice betray him. "How is he?" "Better," she answered. "I took him a book. He likes to read, you know." "Yeah," Jack said, his jaw tensing. "Okay, I'll call tomorrow. Good night." "Good night," she replied, and the line went silent. Jack threw the phone on the couch, his hands shaking. He knew he should go home, stop this game, but he couldn't. He had to know the truth, even if it broke his heart. The next day, Sarah went to Walter's again, this time with a basket of homemade cookies. She told herself it was just a kind gesture, but her heart knew the truth. When Walter opened the door, his smile was warm, but his eyes held the same caution as hers. "You're spoiling me again," he said, taking the basket. "Did Ethan help?" "Of course," she said, her voice light, but her fingers fiddling nervously with the handle of the basket. "He insisted on adding chocolate chips." They sat in the living room, and the conversation flowed easily, as always. But beneath the surface, there was a tension that they both felt. When Walter suggested putting on an old record, Sarah agreed, and the Ella Fitzgerald tune filled the room. They sat in silence, listening to the music, and Sarah felt her resolve melt away. "I missed you yesterday," Walter said suddenly, his voice quiet. "But I know we have to be careful." Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I know, I don't know how to stop." He looked at her, his gaze full of pain and desire. "Sarah, you deserve better than this. More than me, more than this town." She shook her head, her eyes shining. "You don't understand, Walter. You make me feel alive. And at home, I'm just a shadow." They fell silent, and for that moment the music seemed like the only thing keeping them from the edge. Sarah stood up, her heart pounding, and headed for the door. "I have to go," she said, her voice shaking. "This is too hard." Walter nodded, but his eyes followed her until she left. When Sarah returned home, she felt her guilt and sadness tangled in a tight knot. She knew she should stop, but her heart wouldn't listen. Jack, sitting in his apartment, watched Sarah return home, her face paler than usual. He replayed the security footage over and over, but it didn't give him what he was looking for. He began to think that maybe he was wrong, that his suspicions were just a figment of his imagination. But then he remembered the scent of cologne, the texts, her evasive answers, and his resolve returned. He came home Friday night, his pickup truck parked in the driveway as if he were really in Columbus. Sarah met him on the porch, her smile warm, but there was something in her eyes he couldn't read. "How was the trip?" she asked, hugging him. "Fine," he replied, his voice strained. "Lots of meetings, nothing interesting." They walked into the house, and Ethan rushed towards him, holding the model of Jupiter. "Dad, look, I made this myself." Jack smiled, his heart aching with love for his son. "That's great, champ. You're a good boy." But when he looked at Sarah, his smile disappeared. He knew his trap hadn't given him any answers, but it hadn't allayed his suspicions either. He was one step away from the truth, and he wasn't going to stop, even if it meant destroying everything he loved. The snow fell steadily in Willow Creek, as if the sky had decided to blanket the town in white oblivion. By midnight, the streets were deserted, save for the occasional street lamp, its light reflected in the drifts like stars on a frozen lake. The wind howled, swaying the bare branches of the maple trees, a low, drawn-out sound that was the only sound to break the silence. In the Thompson house, the only light was in the living room, where a single lamp cast shadows on the walls like ghosts dancing in the silence. Jack, his soul eaten away by suspicion like rust, had decided that this would be the last night of his agonizing wait. His plan, hatched in the cold apartment in Riverview, had reached its culmination, and he was ready to face the truth, whatever it might be. Jack had spent the last 2 days in his rented apartment, his eyes glued to the screen of his phone, where the security cameras played back the life of his home like a silent film. He had seen Sarah leave in the morning, her steps quick, as if she were running away from something. He had seen Ethan return from school, his backpack bouncing on his back, his face aglow with childish joy. But most of all, he had looked forward to the moments when Sarah headed toward the cottage of Walter, his father, whose name now sounded like an accusation in his head. The footage had been unrevealing, only her frequent visits, her wistful smiles, her returns with disheveled hair and flushed cheeks. But it had been enough to turn his heart into a knot of pain and anger. He couldn't wait any longer. His business trip was supposed to end tomorrow, but today, under the cover of night, he decided to return home. He wanted to catch them off guard, to see the truth with his own eyes, not through the cold lens of a camera. His phone was in his pocket, charged and ready to record everything he saw. This wasn't just a trap, this was his last chance to understand what was happening to his family, even if the truth tore him apart. Jack pulled out of Riverview around 10 that night, his truck sliding along the snow-covered roads, headlights catching swirls of snow in the darkness. He turned on the radio, but the voices of the announcers irritated him, so he turned it off, leaving only the hum of the engine and the whistle of the wind. His thoughts were as chaotic as the storm outside. He thought of Sarah, her laughter when they were first married, her soft arms wrapping around him after a long day. He thought of Walter, his stern voice, his stories of the past, his warm smile as he played with Ethan. How did it come to this? How could his father, a man he respected despite their differences, threaten his marriage? Jack gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, and a rage simmered in his chest, mixed with a pain he couldn't put into words. The town was silent when he pulled up to Willow Creek. He parked the truck 2 blocks away, by an old oak tree where no one would notice. He turned off the headlights, pulled out his phone, and checked the cameras one more time. Sarah was home. He'd seen her walk through the living room an hour ago, carrying a cup of tea. Ethan was apparently asleep, his room dark. But something told Jack that he should be there, that this was his chance tonight. He pulled on a dark jacket, pulled the hood up, and set off on foot, his boots crunching in the snow, his breath curling in the frosty air. The Thompson house was quiet, its windows glowing softly like a beacon in the night. Jack walked around the back, keeping to the shadows to avoid the cameras. He knew where they were. He'd installed them himself, and he moved carefully, like a burglar in his own home. His heart was pounding, each step a drumbeat in his ears. He stopped at the back door, where the snow was packed down, as if someone had recently walked there. The tracks led to the door, and Jack felt his stomach clench. He pulled out his phone, turned on video, and quietly turned the doorknob. It was unlocked. Inside, the house was warm, smelling of the leftovers of dinner spaghetti and meat sauce that Sarah had cooked for Ethan. Jack took off his shoes to be quiet and moved through the kitchen, his footsteps silent on the wood floor. He could hear voices low, muted, coming from the living room. One was Sarah's, soft and trembling. The other was Walter's, low and soothing. Jack stilled, his breathing shallow, and moved slowly toward the doorway, holding the phone so the camera would record everything. The living room was dimly lit, with only the lamp on the end table casting a warm glow. Sarah sat on the sofa, her knees drawn up to her chest, her hands wrapped around a cup that had apparently gone cold. Walter sat next to her, not too close, but close enough that Jack felt the blood rush to his temples. Their voices were quiet, but their words cut through Jack like knives. "I don't know how to go on, Walter," Sarah said, her voice shaking as if she were holding back tears. "I feel so guilty, but I can't stop thinking about you." Walter looked at her, his face serious, but there was pain in his eyes. "Sarah, we've gone too far. I never wanted this to happen. You're my son's wife. This isn't right." "I know," she whispered, her eyes shining, "but you make me feel alive. Jack, He doesn't even see me anymore. Jack stood in the shadows, his phone shaking in his hand as he recorded every word. His heart was breaking like old fabric, and the rage was washing over him in waves, drowning out everything else. He wanted to storm into the room, to scream, to smash something, but his feet were rooted to the floor. He watched as Sarah leaned a little closer to Walter, her hand brushing his knee, and that gesture, so small but so intimate, was the last straw. Walter pulled back, his hand coming up as if to stop her. "Sarah, no," he said, his voice firm but pained. "We can't. For Ethan, for Jack, for ourselves." Sarah closed her eyes, her shoulders shaking, and nodded. "You're right. I need to go." But she didn't move, and Jack saw her hand still resting on his knee, their eyes locked, full of longing and unspoken desire. It wasn't a kiss, nothing explicit, but to Jack it was a betrayal, sharp as a blade. He stepped back, his phone still recording, and walked quietly out the back door, his mind clouded with rage and pain. Outside, the snow was falling harder, covering his tracks as if nature wanted to hide his presence. Jack stood by the fence, his breathing ragged, the phone burning in his hand like a hot coal. He stopped the recording and looked at the screen, where the last frames showed Sarah and Walter sitting too close, their voices full of emotions that shouldn't exist. He wanted to smash the phone, erase the video, pretend he hadn't seen it, but he knew he couldn't. This was the truth he'd been looking for, and now it was burning him from the inside. He walked back to his truck, his steps heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He sat in the dark, his fingers gripping the steering wheel, his thoughts swirling like snowflakes in the headlights. He remembered the first time he and Sarah met at a Main Street cafe where she had spilled coffee on his shirt and laughed while he tried to wipe it away. He remembered Walter teaching him to ride a bike, his big hands holding the seat until Jack learned to balance. Those memories, so warm and vivid, now seemed like poison, poisoning his soul. Jack knew he had to go home, but he couldn't. Not when his rage was ready to explode like a wildfire. He started the engine and drove back to Riverview, to his cold rented apartment where he could hide from the world. He turned on his phone and watched the video again. Every word Sarah and Walter had said burned into his memory like a brand. He'd seen her tears, his reserve, their shared pain, but it didn't ease his anger. It was a betrayal not physical, perhaps, but emotional, and it was worse because it had destroyed not only his marriage, but his faith in his family. Meanwhile, Sarah remained in the living room, her hands shaking as she set her teacup down on the table. Walter had left shortly after their conversation, his face grim and his steps heavy. She sat in silence, listening to the snow pattern against the windows, and felt her heart break. She hated herself for letting her feelings get this far, for putting her family at risk. She loved Jack, she loved Ethan, but Walter. He was like a beacon in her dark sea of loneliness, and she didn't know how to turn back. She went upstairs to check on Ethan. He was asleep, his curls spread across the pillow, a serene smile on his face. Sarah sat on the edge of his bed, her fingers brushing his cheek, and the tears she had been holding back finally spilled out. She knew she had to stop, had to find a way to bring her family back, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Walter, his eyes, his voice, his warmth. In Riverview, Jack sat on the couch, his phone next to him, the video still playing. He didn't know what to do next. Confrontation, divorce, talk to his father. Every decision felt wrong, every one leading to pain. He thought about Ethan, about how this truth would destroy his world. He thought about Sarah, about how he still loved her despite everything. And he thought about Walter, the man who had been his hero and was now his enemy. He stood and went to the window, looking out at the river, glittering in the moonlight. Snow was falling, covering the world with a purity that Jack no longer believed in. His trap had sprung, but instead of clarity, he had only received pain. He knew that tomorrow he would have to go home, face Sarah, face Walter, face the truth. But that night he let himself drown in his rage, his pain, his shock, because that was all he had left. Morning in Willow Creek was eerily quiet, as if the town were holding its breath in anticipation of a storm. The snow that had fallen overnight had blanketed Maple Street in a smooth white sheet, with only the footprints of morning passers-by to mar its purity. The houses slumbered under a low gray sky, their chimneys emitting thin wisps of smoke, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the cafes on Main Street. But there was no warmth or comfort in the Thompson house. The air was charged with the tension of lightning before it struck. Jack, his heart a white-hot knot of pain and anger, returned home with a video that was his doom. Today was the day he would confront Sarah with the truth, and he knew that this was the day their lives would be torn apart like paper under scissors. Jack stayed up all night, sitting in his rented apartment in Riverview, playing the video on his phone over and over. Every look Sarah had given him, every word Walter had said, every gesture they had made was etched into his memory like shards of glass. He had seen her tears, his reserve, their shared anguish, but it hadn't softened his rage, it had only fueled the fire. He had loved Sarah, he had loved his father, but their betrayal, even if it had been emotional, had been a knife in his back. He had decided he couldn't live in this fog of lies any longer. He had to face them, even if it meant the end of everything he knew. Jack came home on Saturday morning, his truck slowly pulling into the driveway, crunching the snow beneath his tires. He sat in the car for a few minutes, his fingers clutching his phone, where the video he'd recorded the night before was stored. His breathing was ragged, and there was a storm raging in his chest, a mixture of shock and pain and rage that threatened to spill out. He looked at the house, where the kitchen windows glowed, and imagined Sarah making breakfast for Ethan as if nothing had changed. But everything had, and he was going to prove it. He entered the house quietly, his boots leaving wet marks on the wooden floor. System, kitchen. Sarah stood at the stove stirring oatmeal, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, her face tired. Ethan sat at the table doodling in his notebook, his curls falling over his forehead. "You're early," Sarah said, turning around. Her smile was weak, as if she sensed his mood. "How's Columbus?" Jack didn't answer. He dropped his bag on the floor, his movements jerky, and pulled his phone out of his pocket. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and cold as a winter wind. Sarah frowned as she turned off the stove. "What happened? You look." "Ethan, go upstairs," Jack interrupted her, not taking his eyes off her. "Right now." Ethan looked at them, his eyes wide with surprise, but he obediently stood up and left, his footsteps echoing on the stairs. Sarah crossed her arms over her chest, her green eyes full of worry. "Jack, you're scaring me. What's going on?" He didn't answer. Instead, he opened the video on his phone and turned the screen toward her. "Look," he said, his voice shaking with barely contained anger. Sarah picked up the phone, her fingers shaking slightly. The video began, the dim lights of the living room, her own voice, shaky and painful. "I feel so guilty, but I can't stop thinking about you." Walter's voice, firm but full of emotion. "Sarah, we've gone too far." Her hand on his knee, their faces too close together. She paled, her hand pressed to her lips, and the phone almost fell from her fingers. "Jack," she began, her voice barely audible. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" he snapped, his voice echoing around the kitchen. He snatched the phone from her hands, his face red with anger. "I saw it with my own eyes, Sarah. You sat there with my father, telling him that he made you feel alive. What am I supposed to think?" Sarah stepped back, her back hitting the counter. "It's not like that," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "We didn't. Nothing happened. I swear." "Nothing happened." Jack took a step toward her, his fists clenched. "Do you think I'm blind? You spend all your time with him, come home with his cologne on your clothes, and now this." He pointed at the phone, his voice shaking with rage. "You betrayed me, Sarah. You and my father." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Jack, please listen. I didn't sleep with him. I was confused. I was lonely. You were always at work. You didn't see me, and Walter, he listened to me. He made me feel needed." "Necessary?" Jack laughed, but his laugh was bitter, like poison. I toil in this damn sawmill to keep this house going, to give you and Ethan everything you need. And you run to my father because he listens to you. That's your excuse? That's no excuse, she cried, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for this to happen. I love you, Jack, but you left me. You always left. Jack gritted his teeth, his eyes blazing like coals. Don't you dare put this on me. You made your choice. And with my father, Sarah, with my father. The doorbell interrupted them, its sharp sound cutting through the tension like a knife. Jack froze, his gaze darting to the door. He knew who it was before he opened it. Walter was standing on the porch, his face tired, holding a box of toys for Ethan. Snow settled on his shoulders like ash. Jack, Walter began, his voice hoarse. I came. Shut up, Jack snapped, his voice cold as ice. He took a step toward his father, his fists clenched so hard his knuckles turned white. I know what you did. Walter frowned, his blue eyes widening. What are you talking about, son? Jack shoved the phone under his nose, the video still on the screen. That's it. I saw you, heard you and my wife. Walter paled, his hand shaking as he took the phone. He looked at the screen, his face twisted in pain. Jack, it's not what you think, he said, his voice quiet but firm. We didn't. Nothing happened. We were just talking. I was trying to stop her. Stop. Jack snatched the phone from his hands, his voice rising to a scream. You sat there, with my wife in my house, telling her she was special. Do you think I'm an idiot? Sarah came out onto the porch, her face wet with tears. Jack, please listen to him. He was trying to do the right thing. This is my fault. You're to blame? Jack turned to her, his eyes wild. You're both to blame. You both betrayed me, my family, everything I had. He looked at Walter, his voice breaking. You're my father. How could you? Walter stepped forward, his hands raised as if to comfort him. Jack, I swear, I didn't mean to do this. I lost Marge, I was lonely, and Sarah, she was good to me. But I never crossed the line. I stopped because I knew it was wrong. Wrong, Jack laughed, his laugh as sharp as breaking glass. You sat with my wife, held her hand, told her she deserved better. That's not a line, Dad. That's a chasm. Sarah whimpered, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were trying to keep herself from falling apart. Jack, I didn't mean to hurt you. I'm confused, That's enough, Jack snapped, his voice echoing across the snowy street. I don't want to hear any more of your excuses. And yours too, he added, looking at Walter. You're not my father anymore. You're nothing to me. Walter froze, his face as white as the snow around him. Jack, don't do this, he said, his voice shaking. We can fix this. We're family. Family? Jack stepped toward him, his face a mask of pain and anger. Family doesn't betray each other. You stole my wife, my home, my life. Get out. Walter opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked at Sarah, then at Jack, his eyes full of tears. I never wanted this, son, he whispered. He turned and walked toward his truck, his steps heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of the world. Sarah rushed after him, her voice full of despair. Walter, wait. But Jack grabbed her hand, his fingers digging into her wrist. No, he said, his voice cold as steel. You're staying here. She pulled away, her eyes sparkling with tears and anger. You can't tell me what to do, Jack. You don't know how I feel, what I've been through. You were never there. I was at work, he shouted, his voice breaking the silence of the morning. I did everything to keep our family alive, to keep Ethan alive. And you ran to my father because you were lonely? Sarah stepped back, her face twisted in pain. It's not that simple, Jack. I tried to talk to you, I tried to get through to you, but you closed yourself off. I'm not making excuses for myself, but you're to blame too. Jack gritted his teeth, his fists shaking. Don't you dare blame me for this. You destroyed our family. We both did, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. We both stopped trying. The words hit him harder than he expected. He wanted to scream, to argue, but the truth in her words was sharp as a blade. He turned away, his gaze falling on the snow that continued to fall, coating everything around him with a purity he no longer believed in. "I can't stay here," he said finally, his voice empty. "I have to go." Sarah grabbed his hand, her fingers cold. "Jack, please don't go. We can fix this. For Ethan." He looked at her, his eyes full of pain. "Ethan," he whispered, his voice breaking. "How am I going to explain to him that his mother and his grandfather—" He couldn't finish, his throat tightening. Sarah began to cry, her hands falling. "I don't know," she said, "but I don't want to lose him. Or you." Jack shook his head, his face stony. "You've already lost me, Sarah." He turned and walked toward his truck, his steps heavy, as if he carried all the pain in the world. He got into the car without looking back and started the engine. Sarah stood on the porch, her figure small and fragile against the snow-covered house. He pulled out of the driveway, his heart breaking, the snow covering his tracks as if he had never been there. Sarah returned to the house, her body shaking from the cold and tears. She went up to Ethan's room, where he was still drawing, unaware of the storm that had just broken out. She sat down next to him, her hand touching his shoulder, and she forced a smile. "What are you drawing, darling?" she asked, her voice weak. Ethan looked up, his smile as bright as the sun. "A rocket. Grandpa said I could be an astronaut if I worked hard." Sarah felt her heart squeeze. She nodded, her tears threatening to spill out again. "He's right," she said quietly. "You can be anyone." But her thoughts were with Jack, with Walter, with their broken family. She knew she had made a mistake. She knew her feelings for Walter were wrong, but she couldn't turn back time. She sat next to Ethan, listening to him babble, and felt her world crumble like a snowball rolling down a hill. Walter sat in his cottage, his hands on the old wooden table, an untouched cup of coffee in front of him. He looked out the window at the snow falling in thick flakes, and his thoughts were filled with regret. He hadn't wanted to betray his son, he hadn't wanted to hurt Sarah, but his loneliness, his longing for Marge, had made him weak. He knew that his affair with Sarah had been a mistake, even if it hadn't crossed the line into physicality. He had lost his son, his grandson, his family, and the pain was more than he could bear. He pulled out an old photograph of him, Jack, and Marge fishing many years ago. Jack, then a teenager, was smiling, holding a fishing rod, and Marge was laughing, her hair blowing in the wind. Walter ran his finger down her face, his eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I ruined everything." Jack drove through the snowy roads, unsure of where he was going. His phone lay on the passenger seat, the video still open, a reminder of his pain. He thought about Sarah, her tears, her words that they were both to blame. He thought about Ethan, the way he would look at him when he found out the truth. And he thought about Walter, the man who had been his rock, his hero, and now his enemy. He stopped by the river, where the snow covered the banks like a white blanket. He stepped out of the car, his breath curling in the frosty air. He looked at the water, dark and still beneath the ice, and felt his heart breaking. He wanted to forgive, he wanted to go back, but his pain was too great, his rage too hot. He was alone, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to find his way back. Winter in Willow Creek had frozen the town, turning its streets into mirrors reflecting the gray sky. As December drew to a close, the Christmas lights twinkling along Maple Street seemed to mock the darkness that had settled in Jack Thompson's soul. Snow crunching underfoot, children sledded outside the town, and the sounds of caroling could be heard from houses, but there was no room left for the holidays in Jack's life. His world, once full of warmth and hope, was now in ruins, and he, driven by pain and a thirst for revenge, decided to burn out everything that connected him to the past. Divorce, custody of Ethan, the sale of the family home, each step was a blow aimed at Sarah and his father, Walter, whose betrayal left an unhealed wound in his heart. Jack didn't come home after the night he found Sarah and Walter together. He spent days in a motel on the outskirts of Willow Creek, where the smell of damp and cheap detergent permeated everything. His phone was turned off, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger and despair. The video he'd recorded in the living room had become his talisman, the evidence he held like a weapon. He knew he couldn't forgive Sarah for what she'd said, for her feelings for Walter, and he couldn't look at his father without wanting to hit him. His decision was inevitable. He would file for divorce, take Ethan, and erase them from his life like ink from paper. Jack's first move was to hire a lawyer, Mark Richardson, a middle-aged man with a reputation as a courtroom bulldog. Their first meeting was in a cramped office in downtown Willow Creek, where diplomas lined the walls and a photograph of Richardson with his two daughters sat on the desk. Jack sat across from him, his fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of his jacket as he told his story. He told him about Sarah, about her frequent visits to Walter, about the video of her confessing her feelings. His voice was even, but there was a steel in it that seemed ready to cut through anything in its path. "I want a divorce," he said, looking Richardson in the eye, "and full custody of Ethan. She doesn't deserve him." Richardson nodded, his pen sliding across the pad. "Do you have evidence? The judge will consider facts as well as your words." Jack pulled out his phone and showed the video. Richardson watched it, his eyebrows raised slightly, but his face impassive. "This is serious," he said, handing the phone back. "We can use this to prove emotional infidelity, but custody is a tricky issue. Courts generally favor joint custody unless there's clear evidence of harm to the child." "She betrayed our family," Jack snapped, his jaw tightening. "She can't be a good mother if she did that." Richardson looked at him, his gaze appraising. "I understand your pain, Mr. Thompson. We'll do everything we can. But be prepared, it's going to be messy." Jack nodded, his eyes as dark as the winter sky. He was prepared for the dirt, for the pain, for anything, as long as Sarah and Walter paid for what they had done. Sarah found out about the divorce a week later, when she was served with a summons to appear in court. She stood on the threshold of her house, her hands shaking as she read the papers, snow falling on her hair, melting against the warmth of her skin. The summons was cold and impersonal, as if their decade-long marriage could be reduced to a few lines of legalese. She sank down on the front steps, her breathing ragged, tears stinging her eyes. She knew Jack was hurt, knew her feelings for Walter were wrong, but she hadn't expected him to go this far. Full custody, no contact with Ethan without his permission. It wasn't just a punishment, it was an execution. Sarah hired her own lawyer, Elizabeth Morgan, a soft-spoken woman with a steely will. They met at a cafe on Main Street, where the smell of cinnamon and freshly baked goods contrasted with the weight of their conversation. Sarah told her everything: her loneliness, her friendship with Walter, how their relationship had become something more than she could control. She confessed her mistakes, her voice shaking, her fingers fiddling with her napkin. "I didn't sleep with him," she said, her eyes full of tears. "I know that's no excuse, but I didn't want to break up my family. I love Ethan. I can't lose him." Elizabeth nodded, her gaze sympathetic but businesslike. "The court will take that into account, Sarah. But the video your husband has makes this very difficult. We need to show that you're a good mother, that you're not a threat to Ethan." "How?" Sarah shook her head, her voice filled with despair. "Jack hates me. He'll do anything to take him away." Elizabeth placed her hand on hers, her voice firm. "We will fight, Sarah, but you need to be prepared for the court to limit your rights. We will do everything in our power." Sarah nodded, but her heart was clenched with fear. She knew her mistakes would cost her dearly, but the thought of losing Ethan was unbearable. The trial began in January in a small courtroom in downtown Willow Creek, where the wooden benches creaked under the weight of the few spectators. The judge, Mrs. Elaine Harris, was a woman in her 60s with a stern face and watchful eyes. Jack sat next to Richardson, his face set in stone, his hands clutching the arms of his chair. Sarah sat across from him, her eyes puffy from crying, and next to her, Elizabeth leafed through her notes. Richardson began by introducing the video, which was projected on a screen in the audience. Sarah's voice, trembling and full of pain, echoed around the room. "I can't stop thinking about you." Walter, trying to stop her, looked guilty, but that didn't soften the impact. The audience, a few neighbors and acquaintances whispered, their eyes darting between Sarah and Jack. "Mrs. Thompson entered into an inappropriate relationship with my client's father," Richardson said, his voice level but compelling. "It is a betrayal not only of the marriage, but of the family. My client seeks a divorce and full custody of their son, Ethan, to protect him from further harm." Elizabeth countered, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, my client admits she made a mistake, but it was an emotional affair, not a physical one. She has never neglected her duties as a mother. Ethan is her priority, and she deserves to be a part of his life." Judge Harris nodded, her eyes unreadable. She called witnesses Ethan's teacher, who testified that Sarah had been an active and caring mother, and Bob, Jack's co-worker at the sawmill, who testified about the rumors swirling around town. Jack testified, his voice hoarse but determined as he spoke of his pain, of the betrayal, of how he wanted to protect Ethan. Sarah, when it was her turn, could barely speak, her tears streaming as she begged the court not to take her son away from her. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice shaking. "But I love Ethan. He's my life. Please don't punish him for my sins." The judge listened intently, her pen sliding across her notepad. After 2 days of hearings, she called a recess, promising to deliver her ruling in a week. Jack and Sarah left the courtroom without looking at each other, their footsteps echoing down the hallway like the final hammer blows on their marriage. The verdict came on a cold February day, with snow covering Willow Creek. Jack stood in the courtroom, his heart pounding, as Judge Harris read the verdict. The divorce was granted, and Jack was given full custody of Ethan. Sarah was granted limited visitation, but only with Jack's permission and under supervision. She could not remove Ethan from home or school without his consent. The judge emphasized that the decision was based on evidence of emotional infidelity and potential harm to the child. Sarah, hearing the verdict, sank down on the bench, her face white as the snow outside the window. She looked at Jack, her eyes full of pain and pleading, but he turned away, his face stony. Elizabeth placed a hand on her shoulder, whispering words of comfort, but Sarah did not hear them. Her world had collapsed, and all she had left was emptiness, cold and endless. Jack left the courtroom, his step steady, but inside he felt his heart breaking. He had achieved what he wanted. Sarah was punished. Ethan was with him, but the victory was bittersweet. He knew Ethan would miss his mother, knew his questions would cut him like knives, but he couldn't forgive. Not now, not after everything. Jack's next move was to make sure Walter never saw Ethan again. He called his father that evening, his voice cold and merciless. "You'll never see Ethan again," he said, cutting Walter off. "You lost your right to be his grandfather when you betrayed me." Walter tried to argue, his voice full of pain. "Jack, please don't do this. It's not Ethan's fault. I love him." "Love?" Jack laughed, his laugh as sharp as cracking ice. "You don't know what love is. Don't call, don't come. You're dead to me." He hung up, his hands shaking. Walter was left in his cottage, his face wet with tears, the same picture of him, Jack, and Marge fishing in front of him. He knew he had lost everything, and that pain was worse than losing Marge because she was his fault. Jack's final act of revenge was to sell the family home. He couldn't live where every corner reminded him of Sarah, of their past, of her betrayal. He hired a realtor, Mrs. Lindsay, and 2 weeks later the house on Maple Street was put on the market. Jack and Ethan moved into a small apartment in the center of Willow Creek, where the walls were bare and the windows looked out onto a noisy street. Ethan, not understanding the depth of what was happening, asked why they couldn't go home, why their mother didn't live with them, why Grandpa didn't come over anymore. "We're starting a new life, champion," Jack said, his voice firm but his eyes avoiding his son's. "Everything's going to be okay." But Ethan was looking at him, his brown eyes full of questions Jack couldn't answer. He held his son, feeling his heart clench, but his resolve didn't falter. He did this for Ethan, for their future, even if that future was built on ruins. Sarah moved into a small apartment above a cafe on the main street, where the smell of baking permeated the thin walls. She continued to work in the library, but her smile had faded and her movements had become mechanical. She wrote letters to Ethan that she couldn't send and kept them in a drawer next to her old notebook of short stories. She tried to fight for the right to see her son, but Jack was adamant, allowing her only rare visits to the park under the supervision of social services. Every time she saw Ethan, his smile was bright, but his questions, "Why aren't you here with us, Mom?" tore at her heart. Walter remained in his cottage, his days filled with silence and regret. He no longer went into town, avoiding the curious glances of neighbors who whispered of the scandal. He wrote letters to Jack, begging for forgiveness, but they returned unopened. His only consolation was the memory of Ethan, his laughter, his questions, his small hands holding a fishing rod. Jack Thompson stood on the porch of the house that was no longer his home, looking at the sold sign nailed to a post by the driveway. In his hand was a key, cold and heavy, like a memory of the past he was about to leave behind. Today, he and Ethan were leaving Willow Creek to start a new life in another town, but the pain of betrayal still burned in Jack's heart, though it was now tempered by the hope of a new start. The sale of the house went quickly. Mrs. Lindsay, the realtor, found buyers, a young couple from Columbus who dreamed of a quiet life in a small town. They were enthusiastic. Their voices rang out as they talked about repainting the walls and planting roses in the garden. Jack listened silently, his face unreadable, but inside he felt something breaking. This house had witnessed his wedding, Ethan's first steps, late-night conversations with Sarah by the fire. Now it belonged to strangers, and Jack and his son were ready to become strangers in a new place. The morning of their departure was cold but clear. The sky above Willow Creek was high and blue, as if winter had finally decided to give it a break. Jack loaded the last of the boxes into his truck, his movements methodical, almost mechanical. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, his backpack stuffed with toys and books, the model rocket he'd made with Walter resting on his lap. Jack tried not to look at it. Every detail about his father was like salt in a wound. "Dad, are we going to come back here?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet but hopeful. Jack froze, his hand on his seatbelt. He looked at his son, at his brown eyes, so much like Sarah's, and felt his throat tighten. "I don't know, champ," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "but it's going to be great where we're going. New home, new school, new friends." Ethan nodded, but his gaze was fixed on the house they were leaving. "And Mom, is she coming to visit us?" Jack gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "She'll visit you when she can," he said, his voice tight. "But for now, it's just you and me, okay?" Ethan didn't answer, his fingers fiddling with the rim of his backpack. Jack started the engine, and the truck pulled slowly out of the driveway, leaving behind the house that had been their refuge, their joy, their tragedy. In the rearview mirror, Jack watched Maple Street shrink, its streetlights and snow-covered trees disappearing into the haze. He didn't look back. The new town they moved to was called Bloomfield, a small but lively town with wide streets and a park where local bands played on weekends. Jack found work at a local furniture factory, where his management skills came in handy, although the pay was less than at the sawmill. He and Ethan settled into a modest two-bedroom house on the outskirts of town, with a small backyard where grass poked through the February snow. The house was new, clean, but empty, no memories, no ghosts of the past. Jack hoped it would help them start over. Ethan had adjusted faster than Jack expected. A new school, new friends, a football team, all of it filled his days with an energy Jack hadn't seen in a long time. But at night, after Ethan fell asleep, Jack would sit on the porch of their new house, looking at the stars, and his thoughts would return to Willow Creek, to Sarah, to Walter, to what he'd lost. He didn't regret his decisions, the divorce, the custody battle, the breakup with his father, but the pain never went away. It was a part of him, like a scar that would never heal. Sarah remained in Willow Creek, in her small apartment above the cafe. The court order had deprived her of the right to see Ethan freely, and each encounter was a precious gem, rare and painfully brief. Jack allowed her to see him once a month, in the park under the supervision of a social worker, and those hours were both joy and agony for Sarah. She brought Ethan books, his favorite candy bars, and listened to him talk about his new school, his new friends, how he had scored a goal last week. But every time he walked away, holding Jack's hand, she felt her heart break. She stopped writing. Her notebook of short stories sat in a drawer, covered in dust like her dreams. She worked in the library, smiling at the children in reading classes, but her eyes were as empty as the winter sky. She wrote letters to Jack, begging him to soften the terms, to give her more time with Ethan, but no answers came. Walter, whom she had avoided since the trial, called her several times, but she did not answer. Their connection, which had once seemed like salvation, was now a chain tying her to the past. Walter lived in his cottage on the edge of Willow Creek, but his life was a shadow of what it had been. He no longer went into town, talked to his neighbors, or visited the cafe where he had once had coffee with Sarah. His days were filled with silence, broken only by the creak of the old radio and the clatter of the logs in the fireplace. He looked at the photograph of himself, Jack, and Marge fishing, and his heart ached. He had lost a son, a grandson, a family, and the loss was worse than Marge's death because he had caused it. He wrote to Jack, begging for forgiveness, but the letters were returned unopened. He thought about going to Bloomfield, knocking on the door of their new home, but he knew Jack would not open it. He was exiled, and this exile was his punishment. In Bloomfield, Jack tried to be everything to Ethan: a father, a friend, a teacher. He took him to soccer practice, helped him with his homework, and read to him at night. But every night, when the house was quiet, he would stand on the porch and look at the stars, his mind full of the past. He would think of Sarah, her laugh, her soft hands, the green eyes that had once looked at him with love. He would think of Walter, his stern voice, his life lessons, his smile as he taught Ethan how to make fishing rods. These memories were like old photographs, faded but still sharp as blades. One night, sitting on the porch with a cold mug of coffee, Jack allowed himself to think about what had happened. Sarah and Walter's betrayal had been the worst thing he had ever experienced. It had torn apart his family, his faith in people, his faith in himself. He had seen their faces in the living room, heard their words on video, and the pain had been like a poison he couldn't expel. But he survived. For Ethan, he had stood up, picked up the pieces of his life, and built a new one, not a perfect one, not the one he had dreamed of, but his own. He looked up at the stars, their light cold but constant, a reminder that life goes on. He thought about how betrayal from those close to you is a wound that never heals completely, but it teaches you to be stronger. He survived not because he was invincible, but because he had Ethan, his son, his reason to live, his hope for the future. Spring came slowly to Bloomfield, with the first green shoots poking through the melting snow. Jack and Ethan began to settle into their new home, adding small touches: a bookshelf, a football by the door, a photo of Ethan on the mantel. Jack found solace in the routine morning runs, evenings with Ethan, working at the mill. He did not forget Willow Creek, nor did he forget Sarah and Walter, but their shadows grew fainter, like footprints in the snow melting in the sun. Ethan, despite his longing for his mother and grandfather, began to smile more often. He told Jack about his new friends, about how his team had won the game, about how he wanted to be an astronaut when he grew up. Jack listened, his heart aching with love and guilt, but he knew he had done everything he could to give his son a new life. At Willow Creek, Sarah and Walter continued to live their separate lives. Sarah saw Ethan occasionally, his smile her only light in the darkness. She began to write again, slowly, hesitantly, pouring her pain onto the page. Walter spent his days in his cottage, his hands crafting fishing rods no one would see, his mind filled with regret. They both knew their mistakes had changed everything, and they were paying for it every day. Jack stood on the porch of his new home, watching the sunset paint the sky pink and gold. He thought about how betrayal is not an end, but a beginning if you have a reason to continue. For him, that reason was Ethan, his son, his star in the night. And with that thought, Jack stepped forward into a new life, leaving behind the shadows of Willow Creek and the pain that made him who he was. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.